Morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in. I'm Maria Volpe. I'm a professor at John Jay College. Welcome to our monthly breakfast that's co-sponsored by the Association for Conflict Resolution of Greater New York and the City University of New York Dispute Resolution Center at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Today is our 240th breakfast since 9/11 when I started these breakfasts. Next month, we will be celebrating our 20th anniversary. Amazing that it's been 20 years since that tragic, horrific morning that virtually, I'm assuming everyone on this call remembers where they were. As a professor, I now find that the freshmen and sophomores, even juniors and seniors, have no knowledge, no firsthand knowledge of 9/11. They either weren't born or they were probably a year old. So it feels interesting to be able to say everyone here remembers, because other audiences don't have the same recollection of that day. Since 9/11, we always met in person at John Jay College. The pandemic has changed our modality, so we've been virtual since April 2020, and all the breakfasts since then are now posted on www.acr-gny.org. And I see that Nikki has put that in the chat for those of you who would like to just click on that. Each month, these breakfasts are made possible by a wonderful committee that plans and organizes them. Includes Julie Denny, Chuck Newman, Matthew Latimer, and Nikki Borofsky. And we are very delighted that each month we are joined by our colleagues who are willing to share with us their knowledge, their skills, their experiences. And this month we are very fortunate to have with us Gary Friedman. We often wish that mediation skills and techniques would be widely used everywhere, universally. Particularly by our political officials, our leaders. And today we're just so delighted that Gary will share with us his experiences in wading into that political landscape. We're so excited how timely it is to have someone from our world, the mediation world, attempt to try to use these skills in the political world. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us this morning. And Julie will do a more formal introduction in just a minute, but I want to share, we did add one feature this morning, and that is that you can turn on the live transcription if you would like. So feel free at the bottom of your screen to activate transcription so that you can get the written spoken word on your screen, as well as listening to the conversation during this session. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie.
Good morning, everyone. I have long been an admirer of Gary Friedman's, although we have never met until about 20 minutes ago. It all started back in 1993 when I read his A Guide to Divorce Mediation. He's since written a number of books, including his most recent, which is Inside Out, How Conflict Professionals, that's us folks, can use self-reflection to help their clients. Gary's been a mediator who, in his own words, practices law as a mediator in Mill Valley, California since 1976. Yes, it's 5:30 a.m. on his clock. He's also a co-founder of the Center for Understanding and Conflict, along with colleague Jack Himmelstein. And also with Jack, he developed a model of mediation, which is now well known as the understanding-based model, where parties are more involved in solving their own disputes. He's done more than 2,000 mediations in his career, and they span a broad array of subjects, including real estate, intellectual property, corporate partnership formation and dissolution, and of course, family law. He's also a trainer and encourages a mediative approach to lawyering for lawyers, judges, and law professionals. We are thrilled to have you here today, Gary. Take it away.
Well, thank you, Julie, and it's really wonderful. I mean, it is 5:30 in the morning, but when I see your faces, it wakes me up. So one request I would have, I am going to try to toggle between the screens because one of the challenges of Zoom is it's hard to feel the people. But when I can't see your faces or pictures of your faces, I feel even more remote. So for those of you who are covered up, I would encourage you to show your faces just so I can feel you and maybe we can feel each other better. This is not a requirement, it's a request. Okay, so you're mediators. You understand confidentiality, and I'm going to be talking about very personal things, and I'm hoping everybody will keep this confidential and not let this circulate. That's a joke. The reason it's a joke is my failure as a politician has now gotten me more attention in the world than anything I ever did as a mediator. Everything I say now is totally public, and you're free to say to anybody anything about my failure or whatever I learned out of this. And I'm hoping I've never much liked lectures, so this is not going to be a lecture. This is going to be interactive, but I'm going to give little segments where I talk about how I get into trouble and big trouble, and then how I try to extricate myself from it, with the hope that this will be useful to you, but we'll titrate that by having you go back and forth with me with comments or questions and challenges. Always love challenges. There I was. I mean, some of you have seen the Politico article. I think that's what got a lot of attention. I've been hearing from thousands of people that have come out of the woodwork all over the world. So happy to see me fail. As I say to people, I think I've gotten more people are really happy to see that I failed, and I think that my failure as a politician is really meant to encourage all of us, because I not only failed, but I survived the failure. So let me just say a little bit about the first part is going to be how I got into trouble. So I decided, I live in this little village and at the edge of the Pacific Ocean in California. There are 250 households, 350 people. And of course, when Trump was running, and I felt so helpless, I thought, well, I might not be able to change national politics, but certainly with my 44 years as a mediator, I can, my little village, I ought to be able to do something there. I found out that local politics is actually, if anything, seems to be at least as hard as national politics. But I had this great impetus to do it, and I was pushed to run. kind of against my better judgment, but I thought, why not? So I lived in this neighborhood for 44 years. Some of the people know who I was. I basically kind of go in and out. Mainly I'm there with my family. But we had an established political leadership. We're a water district and they're a 5-person board. And so I ran on a platform that I was going to bring change. And the change was going to be, instead of having just a few people running the community, we'd get everybody involved. And that came out of my mediative impulse, which is, let's empower the people and let's make this a real democracy. And so if you elect me, you're going to be part of this and you're going to have a voice. And kind of throw the bums out was a little bit of the energy, which was the beginning of the trouble for me, the running. And this is part of the challenge of being running in politics. It's hard not to run against, as opposed to running for. And I felt like my running for quickly turned into a running against. And with this impetus to want to create change, I was pushing the river. But I thought, well, I know how to run a meeting. I've been doing that for a long time. How hard can this be? But I was polarized even before I started, and that's part of the challenge of politics. You run, and in the election, that all the us and them starts to form, and then after you've won the election, you have to govern. And they made me the president because they thought, oh, this guy, he knows how to run meetings, and I won in a landslide. There was a guy that was the previous chair who'd been that for 29 years, and so it was this kind of cataclysmic change. So pretty quickly, I was a trial lawyer before I was a mediator. Did that for 5 years, but I have that deep inside me. And the trial lawyer appeared kind of against my will and against my better judgment. There I was in a position where the people that came to meetings, it turned out I was hoping everybody would now come to meetings once I was elected, because I said, this is your community. And turns out the same 15 people that always came to meetings were the ones that came to meetings. And they were not happy that I had been elected. And they saw fit to kind of try to take me on right from the beginning. And when they did that, that's where my old trial lawyer came out. So I know how to attack and defend. And before I knew, I was doing that. And so when I did that, and I went through this, and I'm really talking about today what it all felt like from the inside. I was encouraged by my family, my friends to do this. And it was because of my commitment to in the last 44 years of trying to work with people in this different way and having a different idea about what conflict was. So I lost myself. I call this my period of derangement. This is a 5-year term I was elected to, unpaid, by the way, and taking more time than any mediation I've ever had. And it's kind of this kind of thankless task that you take on. And people just love taking pot shots at me. And it was kind of fun But as this was going on and the polarization, increasing the polarization, my hope was to bring people together. And instead, it had the exact opposite effect, that the polarization grew stronger. And I was a big part of that. It didn't just happen all at once, but there was a way in which I just kind of lost perspective. 250 people in the village here, listening to Miss Higgy, and we've got big issues in this country. Basically, our little village is white, and what we have, the issues that we have, are not very important. Amanda Ripley, who's written a book where this, the excerpt from Politico came, called High Conflict. It's a great book. She has a chapter on me, and she has real serious conflicts, gang warfare, stuff with the FARC. And then she has my little village that has nothing really very important to deal with, except we're a water district. We need to deal with these issues. So before I knew it, the very basic principles that I live with and been teaching and practicing were kind of going by the boards. And so I'm just going to, for those of you who are not familiar with our work, I'm going to share the screen. These are the concepts that we work with when we practice and teach mediation. I pretty much violated every one of them. Why? Not on purpose. It's just what happened. And of course, we call our model the understanding-based model of mediation, and thinking of understanding as an alternative to coercion is really at the core of what Jack and I developed in the understanding model. And very much the understanding, and many of you are familiar with the technique that we use, that we call the loop of understanding, where we demonstrate our understanding to the people that are speaking, and we use the power of understanding to help people when they're in conflict. And so the thing about the loop of understanding and developing understanding, it's one thing to go through use it as a technique. What's a more important part of it all is what's happening inside. Are we really trying to develop understanding because we really want to understand, or are we using the understanding to kind of pay lip service to the fact to show that we kind of understand, but we're really there to make our points? And it became much more of the latter than the former that I was doing, but my agenda was so strong that I was kind of blinded by it. Letting the parties own the conflict really is about believing in the people and really giving them the power rather than trying to take the power. But it's very it's very appealing when you have a position of power. And of course, as a mediator, what I'm used to is I watch conflict and it goes right by me. It hardly ever is directed to me. And so I know how to deal with that. When the conflict is directed at me, not so good. Not so practiced in that, except to remember my old trial lawyer days. And so I found myself defending and aggressing, just like all the people that I work with who come to me as mediation find themselves doing it, and I can help them. But somehow I got caught in it myself, and didn't really trust that if I could empower the community, that in fact that would work. And of course, this number 4 is a big one, which is, to try to have a deeper conversation in the community. It's very, very challenging when you're having a political conversation and people coming from different places, and we have numbers of people. And so that always felt to me that when we had a problem that we're dealing with, can we go underneath the problem? And we do that in mediation, and to find out what people really care about, with the idea that we're going to try to find solutions that take into account what people really care about, and to have the decisions that we make reflect that. Of course, the other problem was, not as a mediator, I not only work hard not to have an opinion, but I certainly don't express it. As the politician in charge of the decisions that the community was making, our board, I found myself having to make decisions and having opinions. And that was kind of new. And of course, that makes it even harder. And getting the decisions, having the conversation at a level that we could really hear each other and go deeper and feel ourselves as a community was a part of my failure. And of course, allowing tension, that's a really big one. I'm gonna, because tension is a good thing. Conflict's a good thing. There is good conflict. That's what Amanda Ripley's book called High Conflict, How We Get Trapped and How We Get Out of It is about. And so tension means, if we allow that inside ourselves, it's an opportunity to expand. And so, Higgy was talking about differences. And of course, differences are really interesting. Our commonalities are interesting, but as she was also saying, well, it's kind of boring to just have people who all agree with each other. The difference is, if we can tolerate them and work with them productively, actually make us all better. And so you close the tension down by taking over and using power. And power seems to be the thing, the seductive thing that at least I fell into. And then the last principle, support autonomy and honor connection. So it's important that we be there as individuals, but feeling our connection as people and our interrelationship with each other. We are here together in this community. I felt that with part of the community and not with enough of the community. And that was another place I got trapped. So this is all about the trap and how I lost myself. And one of the great signs that I lost myself was my wife and dog would come to the meetings, and they would leave the meetings early. And my wife said to me, after a certain point, I wanted you to run, but I don't know who you are when I watch you running these meetings. And it was like, wow, we've been together 44 years. And so that was really deeply hurtful to me and a wake-up call. And before I knew it, I had really felt such despair and anxiety, and realized I was in a really deep hole. And so I'm going to stop right now. That's the getting into the hole. And now I want to have a conversation with you. And hopefully we'll keep this interactive, and I'll find out what's interesting to you and try to respond to it. It doesn't have to be just questions. It can be comments and challenges, and we don't have to be nice to each other. So a couple of people have raised their hand. That you guys are going to run the questions, right?
Yeah, we have a bunch of hands up. I think that we can turn to Jess Kent, who was the first poster of the question. Jess, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can ask live your question.
Hi, Gary. My name is Jess Kent, and I studied under Dr. Paul Zak at Claremont in California, looking at how high conflicts impacts the neuroscience of someone's brain. My work currently now is as a mediator professionally, but I train candidates on the side to create positive environments on their campaign trail. And I'm curious, my question to you is how the public dynamic of the environments affect the trust building process that you create as a candidate or as a mediator with all the different parties. Perhaps you can speak about that from your experience. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, we have a wonderful community center where we had our meetings. We have a fire in the fireplace, and it's intended to be a kind of comfortable place for everybody. One of the things I did was that in the previous administration, they had the board sitting at a higher level than the people in the community and facing the community. And I changed that to create a circle and for us all to be at the same level. And that was part of my impulse. We're in it together. And so I think that was a good thing for me, but it unsettled people because it was part of a change. And one of the things that I think was really difficult for people and that I underestimated is how hard it is for people to change and how much pushback there is with, we're comfortable with doing our way. Now you're telling us we have to do it your way. And while that was something I thought would be good for all of us, I think I could have gotten a lot more participation in that decision rather than just kind of saying, this is the way we're going to do things now.
George Anuara, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, ran for New York City Council quite recently. And Gary, like you, he unfortunately lost. But he says it was his first.
I would have been fortunate if I lost. I won.
Well,
my
yeah,
problem.
no, I'm sorry. Yeah, right. Well, more on that in a minute. He says it was his first time. He didn't raise much money. He was running against an entrenched incumbent and he's dejected, but many people are encouraging to run again and not give up. And he'd like to know what suggestions you offer him.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem starts with the running. and with the running, I think that you need to feel that you're running to be there for everyone. And that means to really be able to take account of the people that don't support you, that see things differently than you. So already the kind of embracing of everyone, even though you have your platform and the things that you want, to hold them in a way that you're respectful. It's very hard not to get into the being against people. You know, a lot of the studies show that people vote kind of against rather than for. And I think what I took as this mandate that they loved me was more that they wanted to get rid of the other people. And so I kind of was quite puffed up by the whole running. And so I think, I mean, to me, one of the great lessons in all this is humility. I mean, I felt actually humiliated by my behavior. And that was, you know, I can blame all kinds of things and people and all of that, but prime example of is me in how I became untethered. So I think being able to follow yourself and stay true in your running to who you are is really critical. And not to feel like you're going to be caught in an instant polarization, even though that's the structure, that's how it gets set up. We're going to choose you or we're going to choose somebody else. And so why should we choose you? Why? Well, we're kind of more against them than wanting you, and what will you do? So anyhow, I think if I may run again. I don't think so. 5 years was plenty. I'm 77 years old. But in any event, I learned a huge amount in the running and how different the running is from the governing. And when you're there and you've been elected, you've got Now, the question is, how are you going to make peace with the people that didn't want you? How will you reach out to them? And I think, we use this loop of understanding to demonstrate our understanding. And I use that technique, that mediation technique, which works so great in mediation. The thing about the loop of understanding and demonstrating understanding, it doesn't work if you don't mean it. You really want to understand. And if the point of understanding somebody is to then soften them up so you can make your point and convince them that they're wrong, it's a technique that's going to fail.
Great. Carol Hoffman has her hand up.
Hi, Gary, thank you for doing this. My experience of this situation is that of your wife, because my husband, who is deceased, he died a couple of years ago, but several years ago, he was a board member in our little village on the North Shore of Long Island, and the Cold Spring Harbor Lab is there, and they kept buying up property, and it was all tax exempt, and the village was upset about losing the taxes, and he was on the board, and his whole point, he was already elected like you. His whole point was just to have civil discourse, because he was so upset about the way the people were behaving toward one another. Forget about trying to get them to understand, just trying to get them to listen or stop yelling. And, had the same experience with you. It felt like, being there, he was just losing himself.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So, that part of that's a big part of the challenge. I mean, that was one of the reasons I ran, is that people said the meetings were so hostile. Couldn't I create a different atmosphere? As a mediator, I must know how to do that. And of course, when the hostility, we have this in mediation and in trainings. There are people that kind of tend to speak more, and they want to speak more, and they expect more. And so we set up rules, 3-minute limits for people to speak, and the idea was to kind of spread the wealth. But then then I'm there, the enforcer, and it set up this kind of authority relationship. And I was using, moving things along on the surface, but at a deeper level. What was happening is that people were feeling alienated, particularly the people that were most upset and felt most unheard. And it's a big challenge, when there are people that really are angry and they want to express the anger. And so we actually had some other rules that we set up, and having to do with, no personal attacks. But there I was enforcing that. And enforcing that, I became this kind of authority figure, and I could have been much more tolerant. But it really meant that inside me, I had to kind of let go of my agenda of having to make things change, and it was that agenda of wanting to make things change that was so upsetting. One of the things I did, for example, was I created 20 committees to study different things. And one of the things that happened was some of the people joined the committees, but mostly the community was happy not to come to meetings. I thought the meetings were going to be just filled with all these people that had elected me, and they were going to support me. And then I'd come to the meeting. Where were they? Well, they elected me. That was the kind of, they thought they'd done their job. And I thought that was just the beginning. They were going to have a voice. Well, it turns out they didn't want to do the work, and they didn't want to be, a part of it. And they were kind of counting on me to figure that out. So I was there kind of on this island.
That's great. We've got 4 people. I'm going to read your order. Harvey Newman, then Jeremy Lack, then John Landy, and Sunita Kumar. So first, Harvey. Unmute yourself, Harvey.
Yeah, I got it. Okay. Thank you. This was wonderful. I joined a resident council in my senior living facility, and I'm attempting to introduce best practices for the community. And the first thing that happened was that the administration turned on me, telling me that I don't do best practices. and it was really, I just felt incredibly attacked to the point when I thought I was doing something that was going to be useful for the whole community. And and it was very funny to experience. The other thing, one of the early speakers, the first person actually, I can't recall her name now, made the comment about the brain. And I just want to really push Jill Bolte Taylor's book, which I think has tremendous applications for mediation. It's called Whole Brain Living. And it gives you a totally different way of looking at how our brain operates from the inside, from someone who's a neuroanatomist who had the stroke and lost the left side of her brain. And so she rebuilt herself inside her brain and knows what she's talking about, I believe. And it's really a powerful book. And I actually have contacted Jill Bolte Taylor to see if she would present at one of your future breakfasts. So we'll see if that happens.
There's so much that we've developed in mediation and theories and neuroscience, and all this stuff is so great. But in order to make any of that stuff work, we have to deal with the insides of us and what we really are about, and being able to kind of access that and use the techniques in the service of something where we really feel like we're being kind of straight with ourselves. And that's where I think that was part of where I lost myself. I lost my rudder of where I was, and so found myself in a much more reactive place to people than was good for me or my relations with them.
Okay,
Thank you.
Jeremy, unmute yourself.
Yes.
Jeremy,
Hi. So I'm probably one of Gary's worst students ever. I think he had remarkable patience with me when I was training in the early days of mediation. But I've been thinking a lot about some of the things. And Gary, you are one of the, if not the most self-aware person as a mediator from day one. And if you have had difficulties with these issues, being as self-aware as you are, I have difficulty putting this down to personality issues or cultural issues, and I think there might be something more universal. And I cannot try and compare the event you went through, both for your leadership in mediation and separately, because this is election and it's been the media and in the press and that whole status of who you are, and this kind of paradox of you feeling, hey, I'm not doing a great job in politics, wanting to bring mediation to politics. I'm just wondering if there's something universal here that we can be looking at more, which does go back, and I hate to be the third person to raise this, that Jess Kent was talking about, is the neuroscience. And I'm wondering whether in mediations, especially when we're talking about groups of this sort, we are focusing, we have tools or techniques to look at really what I would refer to as social plasticity mechanisms. How is it that we look at groups of people, and how is it, because when we're looping, when we're doing a lot of the things that you have with the understanding-based model, my sense is we're in a binary conversation. You can include other people, but it's very difficult to have your focus on the group. And so it tends to be, kind of a duo. Maybe you can keep your eye contact on two people at a time. But what do we have for groups? And I'm wondering whether that's something that we need to explore. And the idea of social plasticity comes into, first of all, people feeling a sense of belonging in group versus out of group. Empathy, all sorts of other things in the brain are activated or deactivated based on simple priming in the beginning on these things. And the other thing is status. The moment you are in the chair trying to manage the meeting and direct it as a chair, as a person with status, it's very different from the Gary Friedman, the mediator, who has no status and is always made it very clear when he's a mediator that you have no status. You're just here to help kind of the people understand one another better, which is why you like doing things in joint session. At least, again, this is the bad student's understanding of the history of what I retained from what you taught. So apologies if I'm butchering this, but let's look at the mediation community. I think that we have the worst run mediation organizations as a whole. Tends to be lots of bickering and fighting within every single national mediation institution I know. And so for me, there's expression in French that the cobbler is the least well-heeled person in the room. The people who know the best about something tend to be the worst at it. And I'm just wondering if this is not something more universal. And so could I ask you to dig a bit deeper, not just into yourself, because you've obviously been reflecting on yourself, but if you try and step back and look at the pattern of a group, are there any things that you think either triggered a sense of in-group or out-of-groupness that we can be thinking about more when we have large groups of people? And how do you deal with this in a sense of status? Being the one to chair the meeting, but at the same time, kind of trying to follow everybody else's dialogue, and this like herding sheep, or cats rather, not sheep.
Well, Jeremy, first of all, it's great to hear from you, and it's been a while since I've seen you, and you're always so thoughtful. I really appreciate your questions. I think you've raised some very challenging questions. I'm not going to try to answer them all. I'm going to say that to me, the most important thing is to admit failure. Well, that's one of the problems I've noticed in the mediation community over all the years, going to conferences and all of that, is mediators don't treat each other as well as they treat the people they're working with. And I think the competition among mediators and the lack of cooperation, especially in this country, I think it's much better in Europe, but and I go to Europe enough to get a sense of how much coming together there is. And so one of the reasons I wanted to go public with this is to say, yeah, this could, and also, by the way, I hate it when people try to make me into this better than or more self-aware than. I'm just another chicken who's been working hard on myself and trying to do the best I can with myself. And I'm successful a lot of the time, and I'm not successful some of the time. And I think our failures are actually more interesting than our successes. And if we can be talking about those honestly, and without trying to defend ourselves or make ourselves better than, or make ourselves the hero of the story, there's so much more that we can learn. And some of the things that we can learn are it's not just a studying of groups. It's about what is the feeling inside, when we're in a group. I mean, here we are in a group of, I don't know, I think it's 160 people, and we're on Zoom. How do we connect with the people? Do we look at people? What is it that we bring of ourselves to be open to them? And how can we be more interested in hearing about them than having them hear about from us? A big challenge, which I'm working with right now. I am really interested in knowing more about how you guys think about it. I mean it. Because I feel, at age 77, having done this for all these years, I feel like I know so much less than I did 40 years ago. And so being ready to read, to learn, to not defend ourselves, to change, to recognize our vulnerability. And let me just say one thing about vulnerability. To me, the biggest lesson of this is to feel my vulnerability. And when I feel my vulnerability, that is a connector. And people are often feel like, well, gee, don't show your weaknesses. But in fact, it's the weaknesses and it's the failures and it's the vulnerability that we feel. That's the connector. And I actually experience myself as stronger when I show vulnerability than when I hide it, both in mediations and in training And as it turns out, in politics. And so let me just show you what I did to work within myself as I was we have the 3 o'clock in the morning stuff that happens. That almost never happens to me as a mediator, because I really believe it's the party's problem, and I leave the problems at the office. Of course, this was a hard problem to leave at the office, because I was walking up and down the street with my neighbors and my dog, and there they were, the same people that I was. So there was no place where I felt like it wasn't there. So it was there with me. And so it was, I kind of think of as the dark night of the soul for me. So I had to do a lot of internal work. And this is work that we do with people that we train as mediators. But I really recommend this. And this is something in the book Inside Out that we really focus on. But we've got to become aware of what's happening inside us. And this is a system for doing this. And I'll just describe it very quickly and how I went about it. So first of all, how do we know something's wrong? We can talk ourselves into almost anything. Our minds are very tricky and very deceptive, even to us, especially to us. What's not deceptive is our body and our breath. And if we can pay attention to what's happening in our body, in my case, how rattled I was. Why was I rattled? And that's the beginning. So it's about an investigation. I'm there and I'm rattled in my body. I can feel it in my bones. I feel myself tensing, attacks coming toward me. I feel myself kind of closing down. I breathe differently. I start this investigation with the body. And of course, I find myself not liking these people that are attacking me. And so I want to either retreat or push back. And so we go to this next layer of the judgments. What are all the judgments that I have about these people? They're selfish. They talk too much. They're against the people. They're into power. All of these things that I've decided are wrong about them. And then so I let myself feel that inside, and then I start to investigate, what are these feelings that I have? And there are layers of feelings that are part of the investigation, and the layers have to do often with I'm angry, I'm irritated, I'm impatient. Those are all the feelings that I start with. And then I realize there's layers underneath that. And that requires further investigation. What's the fear? And fear and pain are often there at some level. I was so disappointed, so afraid that what I wanted would not come to pass, so afraid that I would not be able to reach them, and the pain of feeling like it's all falling apart was really strong. And of course, when these are this strong, what we realize is this is in relationship to the people that are upset with me. But this is not just that story, because these feelings are so strong. This is also about me. And where does this come from in me? And that's where the deeper work goes, to really look at the origins. Often, going back in my family, I was, in a family of trial lawyers, and there were some early wounds that I experienced growing up that were finding their way into this conversation. We used to have this joke in the family. Well, it wasn't a joke, but when we would have conversations at the dinner table, trial lawyers, it was about the right-wrong framework so captured every conversation we would have. And of course, we were right and the family, anybody outside the family was wrong. And we recreated reality to fit that framework, except the kids. Of course, we were always wrong. So carrying that early experience was really challenging for me. And then, but realizing, oh, that's my story. Now that I've got my story, can I put it aside and be interested in other people? What could be happening inside these people that are so frustrated with me? What could be happening with them in terms of what they really care about? And then I opened to empathy and feeling like I'm curious about them now. Now I'm interested. And now I can actually feel connected to them. And when I did that, I actually found myself crawling back into relationship with people and reestablishing that with a lot of humility. Okay, I see all these hands up. So
Yeah, there are lots of
I'm
hands.
gonna shut up now. Go
No,
ahead.
okay, and because there are, I've got 8 right here.
Go ahead.
So we're gonna ask you all to shorten your questions if you can. Next is John Landy.
Hello, John.
Hello, Gary, another one of your former students.
Yeah, must be decades.
Almost for 4 decades. I took my first training with you in 1982. I took several trainings with you and trainings with others, and yours have stuck with me throughout my career. It's good to see you again and to hear from you, although it's kind of a sad story in some ways, although there's some redemption at the end. I guess I read the Politico article, and I'm curious, I was puzzled because one of the things that I got from you, if I'm remembering correctly, was part of the process that you taught in mediation was a process of discussing and developing the process itself, sort of the ground rules. I don't like that term. And it seemed as if from the Politico article that there wasn't much of that, that you essentially imposed the ground rules. And one that got me crazy was no eye rolling. I don't know where that one came from. And it didn't sound as if you had engaged them in the process, both in terms of the ground rules at the outset, and then also part of your goal that you described was to make it a more collaborative process more generally in terms of the politics of reaching consensus. So can you talk more about what your thinking was? Because it seemed to at odds with,
yes,
I remember your teaching when I was.
You're right. And actually the chapter in the book is much fuller, and this is really truncated. We actually, we had a couple of sessions where we just talked about how we're going to be working together, how, and trying to reach agreements. We did. The people hated those sessions. What are you going to get done? We have decisions that need to be made. The water rates, what are you going to do about? And it was like, well, let's just talk about how we're going to have those conversations. So it was really challenging to engage the community in a conversation about how we're going to do things rather than the what that we're going to do. And so some of those, and then we had what we called the, it wasn't rules of engagement, but it was intended to be something that we thought would create productive conversations. But it's very hard to reach agreement about how we're going to do things when people don't want to even have that conversation, and when they think there is no such thing as how. So that was a big challenge, and especially when you're doing that with a large group, to have that be real is really hard. But absolutely, I think you that's a big place where things fall apart if you don't have real agreements with people about how you're going to work together. So I appreciate your critique.
Well, and actually that's useful to know that you did that, and the reactions, the responses that you got from the members of the group were parallel to my experiences in mediation, where a lot of the parties weren't really interested in talking about the process. They wanted to solve their problems, damn it, and
Right.
and we'll just get right down to it. So that's very helpful to know that you tried at least, and that was part of the problem that you ran into.
Yeah, and actually instituted this thing, which also didn't work, which is at the end of meetings, let's talk about how this meeting went and how we're working together and what changes do we need to make for us to be working together. And it was, you know, there was so much hostility, but see, I sowed the seeds for that. So it wasn't really meant to be, from their perspective, an open conversation. And from mine, actually, I did have a pretty good impulse around it, but it was really hard to implement that.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
Sunita is next. Sunita?
Yeah, sure. Yes. Hi, everyone. Yes, Mr. Friedman, you
Please,
commented on
no
earlier.
mister among us, we're peers.
Okay, thanks, Gary. What are the lessons learned for democracy? You know, here we have, and how can mediation play a role in that based on your experience? Maybe that would be really a great pitch to see, because everything that you've experienced, despite mediation background, did not allow democracy to really, from what I can gather, be fruitful. And yet we're promoting democracy as America across the world. So what would be your lessons, you know, that you'd like to share on that? And you've commented on that in many aspects already.
Yeah, well, you know, Amanda, who wrote this book, High Conflict, has really studied this. And she actually last week testified before Congress about how they could actually learn to talk to each other. But what would be the things that could happen for them to actually create bridges? So this is a big problem. And when you mean democracy, what I think you mean is how to give everyone a voice and have that voice taken seriously. And of course, we have a horrible history in our country about disenfranchising groups of people, and you know, it's a huge problem. But we had that even in our little community. There were people that would come to the meetings that were afraid to speak up. And as much as I would want to encourage them, but they were afraid that they were going to be attacked if they were. And so, it's a bit, you know, I don't have answers for on the politics. I have impulses, but the impulses are, we need to change the rules of the game, you know, and I don't know, I mean, there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of the national, and we're so stuck with campaign financing. It all starts with all these incentives that go the wrong way, so that people can't be real, so that they're just running for re-election, and it's not about, we're really trying to find a way to find out what people think and have that be reflected. So, but what's interesting is that's as hard in a little community as it is in a nation of 300 million people, because people are reluctant, and there's this kind of passivity. And how do you get people engaged and know that they're going to be taken seriously? So you can. So I think there's a lot of one-to-one work that needs to be done. Groups need to be doing that. But I don't have the answer to that. I just think that it's such a, you know, I think the most important thing is to not demonize people. It's really, really hard right now not to demonize people, at least from my perspective, that aren't getting vaccine. We have one in our family. Or to demonize people that are racists. And you know, there's so much pain that we're experiencing. And how do we engage them in a real way that doesn't just become a kind of relative, we're going to make everybody okay, because there's things that are happening that are deeply, deeply troubling. And I think the key for me is, can we bring the conversations to a deep enough level so that we're having the conversation at a level where it can be resolved? You know, that's the problem we have as mediators, right? People want to talk about money. It's just about the money, or it's a business deal. But we know underneath there are all these things that are stirring. And if unless we get to that level, we're just going to have a Band-Aid. And we have to find a way to get to that level. And I'm pretty good at doing that, one-on-one or one-on-three, or even on. But in a larger group, it's much harder.
Gary, it's Chuck Newman. If I could interrupt with a process question. I know you had some other things you wanted to get to. These conversations have been just phenomenal. But I wanted to remind you we're a half hour from the official end, and
Okay.
don't let us knock you off too far from what you wanted to cover.
Yeah.
There are 8 more questioners in line, so we want to do it all. Thanks, Chuck.
So no, I'm interested in hearing more from you. That is real.
Okay. All right, then let's go on.
And I do think that's a big, that is a really important for politicians to really be interested and not have your agenda interfere with actually being interested in what people really think and hearing them.
Okay, then next is Dennis McCoy. Unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you, and Gary, good morning. I've had 5 or 6 different questions float through, and my hand has been going up and down, but you have focused on your contribution to this outcome. And I am curious how you see the role of the citizens. I think Tamika had something up there about how do we get people to involve themselves in the process. But again, there are 2 sides to this equation. It seems to me appropriate citizenship requires involvement. And if people aren't involved, I mean, does that mean that, okay, fine, you've elected to set this dance out? I mean, I understand the postmortem on your performance, but I think there's some responsibility on those who are not, if you will, elected or sitting at the head of the circle.
Right.
How do we bring the citizenship in, and is that a necessary component to resolve some of the conflict?
Yeah, I mean that was the goal was to get people. And one of the things we did is we and this is before I even ran. I was part of a group. We created a survey asking people basic questions about their life at the beach, and then we had people in pairs go to interview almost everybody in the community, and then we had everybody come to a community meeting where we shared the results of that, and it was a glorious, fabulous meeting. We had 150 people show up for that, just about everybody that was there. And it was great, and it was really important. And then we thought, oh, that's great. These are the people, they care about these things. The problem is people, when there's a crisis, we had somebody, they wanted to put in a bus stop by our beloved mailboxes. That got people's attention. Or they want to put in a parking lot down by the beach that they were going to be paving over an old parking lot. That got people's attention. When there's stuff that's going to happen that looks like it's really bad, then people show up. But to say, let's talk about how we can improve our water system, and people don't show up for that. Or when we talk about raising the water rates, which was one of my errors. We framed that in a way, it was raising the water rates. Oh no, you can't do that. But if we framed it in a different way, we would have had more people involved, so that people were against raising the water rates. So a lot of it is how you frame it, but it's also, you can't, I mean, if there's a crisis, they'll come. If it's good, if it feels like you're doing a pretty good job, they don't want to be there at all, unless there's something that and people have their own personal grievances and things that they care about. They'll show up for those. So I'm yet to find the trick. And I think it just takes a huge amount of work. And, you know, I think who knows about this, and we had somebody in our neighborhood that was very helpful, are labor organizers. And it's lots of one-to-one hard work, connecting to people, listening to people, finding out what they care about, and then following through. I didn't have enough hours in the day to really sustain that. But if I did, I think, you know, really staying in touch with people, having conversations with them. Actually, one of the big people said, my kids, I have 9 grandchildren and 4 children, and they all have different opinions about it. They all hated the idea that I was running for office. And my son, who's the most vocal, said, you know, my wife, Trish, she's really much better at this than you are. She should be the one running. And she really likes people a lot more than you do. It's much more tolerant, really listen to them. So I think you have to have that kind of personality where you're engageable, you put that vibe out. And you know, I walk down the street and I couldn't walk, you know, 20 feet without people stopping me, and then they wanted to hear, and they wanted me to listen to their whole story. And I wasn't very good at that. But that's the thing, it's one-on-one.
Well, it sounds like it goes back to one of the fundamentals of mediation, distinguishing between the positions and the needs.
Well, it's also about the fullness of engagement and really being able to signal people that you care about them, that you're interested in them, and that you're going to do your best to try to respond to them.
Thank you.
John German.
Thank you. This has been the most that I have ever gotten on a subject that has always intrigued me, which is Carl Rogers, the father of active listening, when he got into an executive position, was a spectacular failure. And David made a comment that really hit me about it. But I've learned more about why he might have failed in this session than I've ever gotten before. I'm also wondering whether somebody whose whole focus is process, when they get into a position where they have to do content, whether that might set up a situation where you have to know certain things or you're just not going to make it. So thank you for doing this. This is wonderful.
Thank you. You know, Carl Rogers, of course, is one of my heroes, and that deep belief in unconditional positive regard that he had for people really worked one-to-one. And Jeremy points out that the challenge, there's so much more work that needs to be done about how you do that with many people at the same time. And I think, you know, I can do that I mean, I've had some mediations where we've had even a few hundred people involved. And what we have done is we've learned to focus on the different kind of coalitions and representatives of coalitions. So when we do a mediation and we've got 5 different factions, we create a planning group of the 5 people, as John Landy says. And what we do is with that group of 5 people, we have them design the process with us. One of the problems that in politics, and I keep pointing to the problems, is they have what they call open meeting laws. And open meeting laws mean that the 5 of us on the board no more than 2 people can talk to each other privately. So all conversations that involve the potential majority of the board, even serial conversations, are illegal, which meant that as a board, we'd show up together, and that was the first time we found out what other people on the board thought. So it was very hard to create, even among our board, because the public was listening, and the public was wanting to participate. And I just think the open meeting laws are terrific in terms of being transparency and for people to know what's going on. They're horrible when it comes to kind of trying to find coming together around issues that where we wouldn't necessarily predetermine, but we could have a feeling and a feeling of coalescence. So that's another one of those kind of peculiar issues. And of course, even with this, Congress and some of these bigger issues that, that when people are watching, it's a different conversation than when people aren't watching. And of course, as Jeremy pointed out, I've always been a proponent of everybody together. And I think it's really important to do that. And I think it's more empowering when you do that, and that the mediator becomes much more too important from my perspective when they're shuttling back and forth, and particularly if they're holding secrets. But that's in mediation. In these kind of public meetings, there's a different form that's necessary, but we have to find ways around these open meeting laws that allow people to actually talk together so that we can feel more collaborative.
All right, Jonathan Honig. Three, two, one. Oh, there's. Okay, he's not answering. How about Miss Hickey, Helen?
Hi, Gary.
Hi.
You've just given me every reason. People always ask me, why don't I run for office? For every because people don't want the truth. They like people who speak their mind until they really speak their mind. And then it's like, we really don't want to hear that. So
Right.
And it's funny that you say your colleagues told, or your family told you that it was your wife who should run, because a lot of people said that about Michelle and Barack Obama. It was
right. Yeah.
But my question to you has to do with your wife, because I was intrigued when you said that she told you that she didn't like the person that you had become. And I wanted to, that's a part of what I was talking about earlier, those difficult conversations that push us past our comfort zones that we avoid. So when did your wife first tell you that? Was that the first time, or is that the first time that you heard it? And did you surround yourself with yes people? Because I think that's like our biggest downfall.
Yeah. So, we've been together 44 years. I can look at her and know without her saying a word about how she's feeling about me. We're at a party or there's somebody else, or I'm talking to the kids. So, and she's good at kind of shooting me a look. So I knew, also when she and the dog, Artie, would leave the meeting. Ostensibly, she wanted to support me, and she wanted me to run. But I think that it was so uncomfortable for her to see me behave in that way. And I would come home after a meeting and I would say, well, how'd you like it? And she'd say, well, why did you do this? Why did you do that? And I said, you don't know what I'm up against. And so we would have, it wasn't so much an argument as a kind of disappointment. And when she registers a disappointment with me, it really runs deep and touches me in my most vulnerable place. And it was really hard to feel like, my God, if I'm letting my wife down, what the hell am I doing? And so I had to pay attention to that. And that actually brought me to my senses. Although it got worse over time, because it kind of came to a head when we had this a really bad meeting, and that's when she said, look, this is not good for you. You can't go on like this. And she said, and I see how she was really worried about me and the toll that it was taking on me. I mean, I was kind of so, I don't have 3 o'clock in the morning mediation afterthoughts. I did have this whole political thing. It was like I was always trying to figure out what's going on. And it was, I knew in my gut that this was not good. And I needed to do something really to make a change. So I made some decisions. It was interesting in my new incarnation, because we had a new election where I then was deposed as the chair, and I was just a member of the board. And I made some decisions that were really very helpful and reconnected me to people. But a lot of it was becoming empathetic to the other people on the board and people in the community. But one of them was, I wasn't going to talk at a meeting unless I thought something needed to be said that was important, and B, that it needed to be said by me. And if it didn't pass those two tests, I kept my mouth shut. And there were a lot of things that didn't pass those two tests. So I realized how much my ego had kind of gotten a hold of my presence there. And I don't experience it that way in mediation, because I feel like we're there together in a really different kind of way.
Chris Daly.
Thank you. Good morning, Gary. Thank you so much for this talk. I'm a trainer at New York Peace Institute, and I'm a fan of your work, your books, and I read the High Conflict book. And I did, yeah, it's a great book.
Isn't she terrific? Yeah, Amanda is just so terrific. Yeah.
Yes, and it's so interesting. I mean, it felt almost like, oh, one of our own is, in this book. So that was kind of a cool feeling for me as a practitioner. And I guess my question for you centers around one of the concepts that she unpacks in the book, and that I just heard you talk about in reference to Ms. Higgie's question, which is this idea about the illusion of communication, and about how when we communicate, we underestimate how we're coming across with speaking our desires and our needs and what we're trying to say. And we don't really have an accurate read as to how we're doing that. And in conjunction with that, we also aren't entirely clear as to what those are and what we're trying to say and what our desires and needs are. So I'm curious about your experience with your foray into politics as to how it sort of led you to think about how we just communicate overall and how we do so in the process of mediation. So as the guardian of the process, I'm wondering if you have any takeaways from this conflict, this meta conflict that you had in politics as to basic fundamentals of communication.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're raising something that I think is so powerful, so important in life, which is, how do we get feedback, honest feedback from people whose feedback that we value and we would trust, and have that be real. And we have in our programs what we call a buddy system, where people that we're training over time actually have weekly conversations with each other, where they really talk about and they speak the same language about how they're really coming across. And I think it's incredibly rare and valuable, and it requires a couple of things. One is we need to want to do that. And it's become, is it more interesting to hear the truth than it is to preserve our self-image? And I think we all struggle with that. And that's why there needs to be some kind of mutuality. So I would say, having, at least one person or a group of people, small group of people, where you really learn to give and get feedback and have it be really straight. And also realize that feedback that people give, that's always the problem, is you need to filter it, because it's about them as well as it's about you. And you take what comes from that resonates inside you. And that's why learning to use yourself as a barometer inside, what is it that I'm experiencing as I'm hearing somebody talk about me, that they think I'm selfish. Does that ring a bell? Yeah. And if it rings the bell, time to take it seriously. And if it doesn't ring a bell, you put it aside. And then if you get it from multiple people, it's time to take it seriously again. And so having these relationships, and that's one of the things that you know, with your organization, Michelle, is so great. It's a chance, and you can do this where you have chances to talk to each other one-on-one or one-on-two, and have it be straight and not have it be about, I'm just trying to advance my career, or I want you to come to my program or read my book or send me cases. And if we can get past that, then I think it really is enormously helpful. And I also have, and it's very important for me, a meditation practice. And so the conversations that I have with myself, although when I was really rattled, I have to say, in the worst of the political thing, I could hardly sit still, which was another sign, by the way. But to be able to have the conversation with myself there, and also writing about what's happening inside, where you don't have to worry about how somebody's receiving what you're saying, and just, you know, pouring it out and seeing what it is that's coming out on the page, and to do that without you know, kind of going past the tricky mind. Just let the hand lead you, and to see what you're writing about, what your internal experience is on a regular day. I think that really strengthens that muscle of inside trying to, am I answering your question?
Yes, yes,
Okay,
you are.
all right, good. All right. So anyhow, those are some thoughts.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I just want you all to know Terry Riker, then Jeremy Lack, Mark Kleiman, William Sparks, Andrea Hirschman, Kai Phillips Jones. That's the order. So Terry Riker, you're next.
Hi, Julie. Thank you. I'm just calling in because I find it fascinating that you picked this topic. Gary, I don't think we've ever met, but I'm a mediator and a trainer primarily in New Jersey, and I work with John Hyman on some programs, and he insists that we put all your materials in our training. Yeah. So the reason I called is because I am involved in politics. I've been a local council person for 12 years, a council president and a councilwoman. And you said a number of things a few moments ago that really resonated with me. And really, they were the comments going back probably 10, 15 minutes ago, but as Julie indicated, we're waiting patiently online to speak. And your comments about failure, really learning more from than other experiences. And I've run a number of times, and I ran well, did well, and then I was asked to run for something that I ended up losing. You know, they tried to push me up the line. And having lost, but still stayed in the original position, people perceive me as much more vulnerable, much more real, much more accessible. And frankly, I think their attitudes change towards my propositions towards change. Whereas originally when I came into the position, they weren't necessarily interested in hearing all the changes that I wanted to make. Right. Whereas once I had run, put up a good fight, lost, but I was still there, I was treated as a different person. And your comments about Oprah were right on target. As good as they are for transparency, they really do impact our ability to talk and try to find a common ground. I don't know that enough people have either written or spoken about that, and we very much experienced it. And I just want to thank you, because for all the decades that I've been doing mediation and been involved in the ADR community, it never occurred to me to think of these two things in to how they work together. To me, it was my mediation life and my politics life. And boy, you really put them together this morning. So thank you.
Thanks. You know, I've become much more likable since I failed. It's amazing how much more people are so they, you know, nobody loves it when you're just this kind of winner, and you're just, and there's an arrogance and all of that in the distance, and people think you're something you aren't. When they see you're a failure, that you realize you're just like them. And I hope for the people that I train as mediators that part of the lesson is, don't, that pedestal you might have put me up on, pull it out. Doesn't help me, doesn't help you. And we're just people, and we're all subject to all kinds of stuff. And I love hearing this story about Carl Rogers, because I hadn't known that about him, and he's one of my heroes, and now he'll be down more at a level where I'll find him accessible.
Jeremy had a follow-up question.
Yeah, so Gary, you said tension is sometimes good, so I'll provide a slight source of tension here. When I asked my question, thanks. So when I asked my question before, I was actually trying to go away from the answer that you did give, because I was asking, what might there be missing other than this ability to look deeply into yourself? What is it that is not just about emotion and cognition? And I was trying to think about social plasticity, groups, people. Yes. And you've made a few comments on that, but I'm still not sure. So and you took the answer to say, well, go deeper into yourself. And you can look at it going deeper and about yourself, but let's assume for a moment it's not about you. It's not about what Gary did right or wrong. It's simply that we've got to face the fact that when we are dealing with a situation where there's a group, and there are different groups, there are factions within the groups, and some people have that role of speaking on behalf of others and taking kind of a leadership position. And so your two rules of, do I need to say it? Does it need to be said? Might not apply. How do we deal with the groups? How do we deal with this concept of social plasticity, where people can actually listen and engage with one another, not at the individual one-on-one level, but at the group level? And I feel you kind of dodged the question, so I'm going to come back and ask you again. What do you think could be done differently to do that? I'll give you one example. There you are chairing meetings, and you say it's when you're no longer the chair that you could actually start to play a different role again. So we say in mediations, let's always bring an external facilitator, a person who has no status. Did you ever, as a chairman, for example, think of bringing in a person with no status to chair your meetings? And if not, why not? Because this is one of the difficulties we find in mediation, which I'm beginning to wonder, is this a structural kind of social plasticity issue, that we need this feeling that there's somebody there who is in charge?
Yeah, okay. You're not going to be happy with my answer, but it's not going to be about going more deeply inside. I do think that what we need to have, rotating chairs, for example, is something that I think is useful, so that nobody gets kind of fastened on they're the one running the meeting. And I think if we can exalt the position of chair less than we do, and create a more equal group of people running things, it's a great thing. It's really a great thing when for a group or anybody to say, we're stuck, we need some help. It's very hard to get people to admit that they're stuck, because they're so afraid that if they're stuck, that means they're not going to get out of it. That's true in mediation too. But I find in mediation, it's critical to be able to, I'll articulate, I think we're stuck. What do you think? And so getting group agreement that we're stuck is, I think, a huge step. It's like, now we can define the problem. And once we've defined the problem, maybe now we can solve it. And if we can get the input from enough different people. And I think there are different ways of doing that, Jeremy. One of the things, for example, is, it's not like, some people are verbal and some people are, can articulate easily. Some people have really great thoughts, but they don't want to speak in public. So we need to give them alternative ways of registering their views, and not just up and down votes. So I could imagine if we were really focused on trying to get more participation in the group, that we could create forms where people would say, here's a question. Everybody just write down or those who you want to write down? Would you write something down in terms of your view, or what do you think is being left out of this conversation? Or how do you think this conversation is going? Again, getting the how question there is really important, because that will often point to what do we need to do to change the way we're going about dealing with this.
I'm wondering if there's something you're overlooking, which is even maybe more important. Because if
Sure.
you say that everybody agrees that we have a shared problem, it doesn't mean necessarily you move to problem solving. What you've actually done is you've created an in-group script of we are now belonging to another because we want to solve a problem together. It's that sense of a common purpose and a desire to do something together that is not palpable, that allows you to take that social connection step of in-groupness before you even move on to the problem and the process design. And it's what I'm just trying to work about is that, do we have this blind spot in mediation? Do we have this blind spot in the trainings where we are not maybe thinking enough about what is it that we do to create that group dynamic? What is it that we do to, without going to problem solving the hows or the whats or where we go, that we are just making sure that there's a sense of belongingness to everybody. And it's not the dyad between you and Gary and Jeremy in the room. It's everybody's involved in a conversation that, we have a problem that we all want to be solving, and let's try and work together as a group, which creates a sense of belonging.
Well, and I think that's a really interesting idea. And I think mostly that stays implicit. And I think making it explicit could be enormously valuable. I'm going to think about that. I think that's really an interesting thought.
All right.
No more questions.
It is, you promise? It is 10 o'clock. There are 5 more people in line. Gary, I guess the first question is, can you hang on a little longer?
Sure.
And the second question is, do we open up the room or do we go with the 5 more questioners? Personally, I'd opt for the 5 more questioners. They've been waiting in line and I hate to turn them off. Is that okay?
I'm letting you run this meeting.
Yeah, hearing no objections. My friends will text me, I know. Mark Kleiman, you were next, and then William Sparks, Andrea Hirschman, Kai Phillips Jones, and Fred Lee Kaplan. That's it.
Gary,
That's
please
the
be
boss.
as brief
That's
as you
the
can. I'm
boss.
sorry to have to do this, but it's to get everyone in, we really need to be brief, please.
Me too.
Okay, Gary, first I want to tell you that I appreciate your courageousness in, basically throwing out all your dirty laundry and everybody to see and to really analyze. For me, I think the issue is it's really hard for quote leaders and the issue of power. I think you need to be a facilitator. A woman that I knew who was really a phenomenal facilitator when my agency was getting into community organizing and et cetera, and developing community-based programs. Her name was Lori Charkoudian. She was Maryland, brilliant, really. She's now a legislator down there. So she's learned how to make the transition into politics. And we both shared a very a common approach, and that is to get to the meaning, the values, and the principles that underlie the party's positions. And because values tend to be in common. Whether
Mark,
it's,
your question.
My question. Oh, my question is to what extent have you plumbed that? I mean, it has to do with reframing to some extent, but I think it goes deeper than that. And I've found it to be very powerful in gaining consensus.
That's the core of our model. That the depth, identity, values, meaning, That's there underneath all disputes where people care about it. And if we can get to that level, and people can get to that level in themselves and understand that with each other, it creates a totally different process than where you just stay at the surface level or even the level of what's called interests.
William Sparks.
Harry, it's Will. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
All right. So Gary, going back to one of the statements you made early, as one former litigator to another, what I want to know is, when you first took over the district, did you enjoy that inner litigator being unleashed?
Oh, of course. I mean, you know, the thing is, as a trial lawyer, when you win, that kind of euphoria, although I found it often short-lived, and it would be hard after I won a case to look at the other side to see, you know, I felt bad for them. But yes, of course, winning is great. And, you know, I like to win at everything I do. And that's just part of my personality. And so, yeah, I mean, and that's part of the challenge for a mediator. What is winning? How do we take that energy that was so helpful for us to be effective litigators and use it when winning isn't, you know, and winning isn't I won, or it was my mediation, or I solved the problem. So we have to find a satisfaction that comes from knowing that we helped people do this themselves, and it was they that did it. And,
Yeah.
and I've spent the last 44 years cultivating the joy that comes from seeing other people succeed rather than
Sure.
it be about me.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Gary.
Yeah.
Andrea Hirschman,
Hi, Andrea.
unmute yourself.
Hi,
Thank you.
Gary. How are you?
Yeah.
So nice to see you. You know, the one of the main things that I've been trying to read about is about the polarization in and the whole binary system, and I was wondering if you read I forgot his name, the author's name escapes me, the book The Way Out.
Peter Coleman.
Yeah, Peter who?
Coleman.
Yeah.
Peter
and
what?
Coleman.
Coleman,
Columbia.
Okay.
C-O-L-E.
Oh, I've heard of that. I haven't read
yeah,
it,
Peter,
but I know
oh,
about
yeah.
the word. Yes.
Yeah, how to overcome toxic polarization, the way
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
And anyway, one of the things that he just talks about is I haven't read it fully, but what I've read so far, I'm in the middle of it, is I'm finding fascinating. But basically one of the things he says is well, putting it in my own words, a lot of people who feel like they're not heard, right? They feel finally someone's listening to me. We all know that, right? When we loop and we get that response from someone, we're very happy. And a lot of these people, they some of them are why they love Trump. The people who maybe felt bullied in their lives. I mean, I don't mean to simplify, but just using one possible explanation of someone who maybe felt so bullied in their life, and finally someone standing up to the bully. So, and they call that then you start subscribing to this worldview, and he calls it a low energy state. It's an attractor. You get sucked in, and it's very easy to get sucked into that. But the hard work is it takes great effort to escape that. And so, I hear you, Gary, saying, you got sucked into conflict, things you lecture about and all. And the great effort it took for you to realize that and to escape it and to rebuild all those relationships. But I was curious if you read that book, but it sounds like you haven't. No. And I was wondering, I was wondering, because I really would love to hear, how to integrate that, or I just would love to hear your perspective.
Well, yeah, here's the challenge. The challenge is when there's a disparate power between people that you're working with, and that's whether you're working in politics or you're working in mediation. How do you address that power imbalance without getting sucked into being the advocate for one against the other. And I think, you know, there are many layers to that question, and there are many different analyses of different kind of powers people have. But I do think that's a kind of fundamental challenge we have, where you know, when people don't have a voice, and they are not going to have a voice unless something strong happens to be able to support them, and hopefully you can do that in a way that doesn't shut down the others. But I think that's a huge problem in politics. And of course, what's so seductive, even for us as mediators, as well as for lawyers and politicians, is to feel like you're championing the underdog. And the underdog doesn't seem to, and to be able to be the voice for the underdog. The thing that's so interesting is when and I've seen this happen with so many lawyers in mediation, they speak for their client and they think by speaking for their client, they're empowering their client. But in fact, they may be disempowering their client. And it's much trickier to be able to, as a lawyer, to be able to support somebody to speak for themselves. It takes much more skill than saying the thing for them that is going to might be much less empowering for them. More empowering than not having it said at all. But could we take this other step where we could actually support them to have their voice and make sure that their voice gets expressed and heard?
Hi, Phillips Jones.
Thank you. And thank you for staying on, Gary. Nice to see you again. So I've been really excited over the past year to see how this technology, like what we're using right now, has really brought people together and lowered the barrier to entry for a lot of processes, including mediation. To what extent do you think lowering the barrier to political participation, perhaps via technology like this, could be a solution to getting people, like in the community that you are involved in, more participatory?
Well, you know, we've had all of the meetings, the district meetings now are on Zoom. No more people show up to those than showed up for them in person, which is really, really interesting. I mean, I just think there's so much apathy. There's so much apathy, or people feel like it's hopeless. You know, it's so bad. I mean, right now, say somebody, you know, run for office. You know, it's just like, what, just beat my head against a stone wall. So I do think it's really hard. And I'm not sure that the technology helps make, you know, I mean, here we are, 3,000 miles at least for a lot of us apart. So, and we're getting to talk a bit, but it's not the same as if we were in a room together. And, you know, we could feel each other and we could, you know, read each other and we could recognize that, you know, what do they say, 80% of communication is nonverbal. So I would not want to, you know, mistake that the magic of technology for the in-person experience. I don't think anything can replace the in-person experience.
I've spoken by the man who said, please turn your video screens on. I want to see you.
Right.
One more, and it's Fred Lee Kaplan. And after that, we're going to post a screen that talks about the next training for the center. Nikki, can you do that after Fred Lee's question?
Absolutely, ready to go.
Thank you, Fred Lee.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for getting my name. I work with a volunteer organization that enables hospitals in emerging countries to develop their own pediatric cardiac surgery programs. As a clinical social worker, I'm working with them to develop humanized care programs to empower the staff and the families to have voices in their own self-care and the care of the children. Working with these staffs, they're all work together. They're in a tight group. And it's more difficult, I think, to help people become more vulnerable when they work together every day and when there is hierarchy in the groups. I have limited time that I can work with them, and you may not necessary for you to answer me right now, but I would like to think about the best ways to help these people feel safe. And part of it is through my own authenticity as much as I can. But I also try to create group experiences where they themselves can experience themselves or in a medical system that does not encourage vulnerability. So I want to just
No, that's a great, yeah, and look, safety for what? Is, you know, that's what I would ask you. What safety to say
to be able to support each other, to be able to relate empathically to families that are under great stress and sometimes cause them stress by yelling at them or being oppositional or just not being able to work with them as needed to support the children. And these parents love the kids and they really want to help, and the staff really is very caring. But when you have two groups that employees who work together every day, who may or may not be able to be vulnerable with each other, to support each other.
Yeah, I think it's real. First of all, your work sounds just wonderful. I have great
Thank you.
Admiration for it. The openness, I think there's a myth about openness. The myth about openness is that, you know, we want people to be open and honest. Bullshit. There's no such thing as openness. We're always, you know, there are always things we're not showing. And so so sometimes I think maybe the goal is, or people use the word transparency. That's another one I don't believe in, but maybe translucency. You know, so can people take a step to say more, show more than they would, and what do they need? And so identifying the barriers to openness and the barriers to feel, what's the danger that needs to be addressed for them to feel safe. And having that conversation is a huge step forward. If people are willing to admit the danger, then you're going to be able to create the safety. The problem is if they're not willing to even say what the danger is. So what can you do to create the conditions under which they would feel safer to say what the problem, what the danger is, and then maybe find a way to address it. But I think you're right. Your first instinct is right. It's how you are with them that will make a huge difference.
Yeah, I think the one more point, that the danger for them is pain and loss, especially dealing with possible death, especially the nurses and the docs in the ICU. So that's very helpful to help them get to their fears as one of the barriers to even to sharing with themselves what they're afraid of.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's about normalizing. I mean, we're all going to die and we're all going to have pain. Absolutely guaranteed. Every human being has pain and death. And to realize that, yes, this is really more intense. It seems more imminent. It's right there in my face, but it's also very normal in terms of being a human being.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
Gary, I think you have broken the record for group participation.
Oh.
And we're going to post the screen now. And after that, it's Sergeant Denny signing off. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It was really great. I loved doing this. It was wonderful to see old faces meet new people. And I just wish you all luck. And maybe if you have these breakfast meetings in New York in person someday, I'll find my way to one.
Great. And there's the training information for those of you who'd like to take it.
Yeah, we have centers on the East Coast and the West Coast. This is going to be online, the East Coast training, and then we're doing one in the West Coast for people that want to do it in person in November. So thanks very much.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Gary, this was wonderful. Thank you.
Good, thanks.
you.
Yeah.
And we'll keep the